Say something, damn it! Elliot's voice cracked through the silence like thunder. Amara froze, the silver tray trembling in her hands. She had just set down a cup of coffee, a little too close to the edge of the table. The porcelain rattled softly. He noticed. Of course he did. "Do you even hear me?" he snapped, his piercing blue eyes narrowing in irritation. "Are you deaf or just lazy?" The words sliced through her chest. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her throat tightened and her lips parted, but only air came out. The faintest sound escaped her. Half a whisper, half a breath. Elliot slammed his fist on the table, making her flinch. "Get out of my sight before I fire you!" The other servants froze mid-step. No one dared move. Amara bowed her head, her curls spilling over her face, and backed out of the room with trembling fingers gripping the tray. Her cheeks burned. She didn't cry. Not here, not in front of them. But behind the grand glass doors of Whitestone Manor, tears finally found her. The mansion was a cathedral of silence. White marble floors, tall windows, and chandeliers that reflected 1,000 cold lights. Everything gleamed, but nothing felt alive. Amara often thought the place was beautiful in the saddest way imaginable, like a diamond locked in a coffin. She had been here for only 2 weeks. 2 long, endless weeks since she'd stepped off the bus from her small hometown in Georgia, clutching her employment letter and a second-hand coat. She had told herself she could endure anything for her brother Caleb. His surgery was scheduled next month. Her wages here could finally pay for it. So she worked quietly, precisely, speaking as little as possible. She followed every rule, avoided every gaze, but it was never enough, not for him. Elliot Vance was the kind of man who filled a room even when he was silent, tall, immaculate, with a voice that could warm or wound depending on the hour. At 35, he'd built a global empire from nothing, transforming a small real estate firm into a billion-dollar corporation. To the world, he was a genius. To his staff, he was a storm, unpredictable, relentless, and impossible to please. They said his anger came from pressure, that he was haunted by success. But Amara sensed something deeper, something sad beneath the anger. The way his eyes sometimes lingered on family photographs he thought no one saw. The way he stood by the piano at night but never played it. Still, knowing his pain didn't excuse his cruelty. That evening, Amara sat in the servants' quarters, staring at her hands. The same hands that had dropped a tray once last week. The same hands that couldn't seem to move fast enough when he barked orders. She flexed them slowly, the motions of sign language spilling out instinctively, words to herself. "You're okay. You're okay." Across the room, 2 other maids whispered. "She doesn't even talk," one muttered. "I heard she's half deaf." "Then why hire her? He hates incompetence." Amara pretended not to hear. But her ears, though imperfect, caught the sting of every syllable. The next morning, the mansion buzzed with tension. Word spread that Elliot's mother was arriving. Margaret Vance, the legend. The woman who had raised him alone and then vanished from public sight after his rise to fame. No one knew why they didn't speak anymore, but everyone knew this visit was unexpected. The staff polished every inch of the house. Fresh lilies filled the vases. Amara worked in silence, adjusting napkins, aligning cutlery, moving with nervous precision. When the limousine rolled up the drive, she caught a glimpse of the older woman stepping out. Margaret was elegant but fragile-looking. Silver hair, soft eyes, and a gentle grace that made the air around her feel warmer. She smiled kindly at the staff, thanking them one by one. When her gaze landed on Amara, something flickered. Curiosity. Compassion. "You're new here," she said softly. Amara nodded, unable to meet her eyes. She gestured clumsily in sign language. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret blinked, then her face softened. She lifted her own hands, slow and deliberate, signing back. "You sign?" Amara's eyes widened. She nodded again, a small smile ghosting across her face. For the first time since arriving at Whitestone, someone had spoken in her language. That night, after dinner, Elliot and his mother sat across from each other in the great hall. The tension was suffocating. "You didn't have to come here," he muttered. "I wanted to see you," she replied. "It's been 10 years. "Exactly," he said sharply. Let's not pretend this is a reunion. Amara was standing by the door, refilling glasses, pretending to be invisible, but she could feel the air cracking between them. Old hurt dressed as pride. When Margaret coughed, Amara instinctively stepped forward, offering a napkin. Margaret smiled faintly and whispered, "Thank you, dear." Then she signed discreetly, "He's angry, but he's still my son." Amara's throat tightened. She signed back without thinking. "He doesn't know how to listen." Margaret's eyes softened. There was a glimmer there, recognition, maybe even sorrow. Elliot, catching the small movement of their hands, scowled. "What are you two doing?" Amara froze. Margaret straightened. "She was simply telling me the coffee is still warm." Elliot's jaw tightened. "Well, I prefer words, not charades." His tone was sharp enough to cut glass. Amara bowed her head and hurried out before he could say more. Margaret watched her leave, and then turned to her son with quiet disappointment. "You've become cruel, Elliot. You speak like the world owes you pain." He didn't answer, but for the first time in years, her words stung. Later that night, Amara stood alone on the back terrace. The river shimmered under moonlight. She lifted her hands again, signing softly into the air. "I wish someone could hear me." Behind her, unseen, Margaret watched through the window, her own hands echoing the same words. Two women, one young, one old, both unheard in their own ways. And though neither of them knew it yet, that shared silence would soon change everything. The next morning began with sunlight piercing through the vast glass walls of Whitestone Manor, gilding the marble floors in gold. Yet the house itself felt colder than ever. Elliot's mood set the weather indoors, and today it was a storm. He was pacing the length of the dining hall, sharp suit immaculate, phone in hand, barking at someone on the other end. "If the deal isn't closed by Friday, I'll find someone who can do their job." He ended the call and slammed the phone down, eyes flashing toward the staff. "Where's my coffee?" Amara, standing by the doorway with a silver tray, stepped forward quickly. She placed the cup before him, careful, measured. Her hands trembled slightly. She prayed he wouldn't notice. He did. He always did. "What is this?" He pointed at the coffee. "It's lukewarm." She blinked, flustered, mouthing softly, "I'm sorry, sir." His voice rose. "You're sorry every day. But it doesn't change anything, does it? Maybe you should find another house to whisper apologies in." The words hit like stones. The staff looked away. No one interfered. But before the humiliation could deepen, a voice cut through the tension, gentle, yet firm. "Elliot." It was Margaret. She had appeared at the edge of the room, her silver hair glinting in the morning light. There was a quiet authority in her tone that froze even her son mid-outburst. "She's new," she said calmly, "and frightened. You were once the same." Elliot's jaw tightened. "This is my household, Mother. I'll handle my staff as I see fit." Margaret didn't argue. Instead, she looked at Amara and smiled kindly. "It's all right, dear. You can go." Amara bowed her head, murmured a thank you in sign, and slipped out the door, though the trembling in her fingers didn't stop for minutes afterward. By noon, the house had quieted. The staff moved about their chores carefully, whispering to one another about the tension at breakfast, but Amara's thoughts were elsewhere. She found herself in the east garden, trimming roses beneath the tall willow trees. The scent of dew and earth calmed her. She loved this place. It was the only corner of Whitestone that didn't echo. She didn't hear the footsteps until a soft voice spoke behind her. "You sign beautifully." Amara turned, startled. Margaret stood there, hands clasped, a faint smile on her face. "Oh," Amara mouthed, her heart fluttering. She signed quickly. "You know sign language?" Margaret nodded. "A little. I learned years ago after I lost hearing in my left ear. I never forgot it." She smiled warmly, then signed back. Slow, graceful, practiced. "You're shy, but not invisible." Amara's breath caught. No one had ever said that to her. Not like that. They sat together on a wooden bench beneath the willow. For the first time since arriving at Whitestone, Amara's hands moved freely, her thoughts pouring out in gestures. She told Margaret how she'd grown up near Atlanta, how she lost half her hearing to a fever as a child, how she'd worked since she was 16 to support her brother Caleb. Margaret listened intently, signing now and then, eyes glistening. "He's a lucky boy," she said softly. "You've carried too much alone." Amara hesitated, then signed. "You remind me of my mother. She passed last year." Margaret reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "Then let me be her for a little while." Tears stung Amara's eyes. She nodded, smiling faintly through them. That afternoon, Margaret asked Amara to accompany her during tea. They sat together in the solarium, a room made entirely of glass, sunlight filtering through the leaves. Amara poured tea carefully, and Margaret began teaching her old signs she'd forgotten, names of flowers, emotions, even poetry lines she remembered from youth. Their laughter, soft, wordless, bright, filled the air. But on the second-floor balcony, unseen, Elliot stood watching. His mother hadn't laughed in years. His jaw tightened as he watched her smiling with the maid. The sight stirred something inside him. Jealousy, confusion, and an anger he couldn't name. How could this shy girl break through the walls his mother had respected for a decade? When Amara accidentally glanced up and saw him watching, she froze. Their eyes met for half a second. His cold, hers startled. And then she looked away. That look was enough. By evening, Elliot's temper was back in full force. He found Amara polishing silverware in the dining hall and strode up to her, voice low but cutting. "Did my mother ask you to entertain her?" Amara blinked, confused, signing slowly. "She wanted company." He frowned. "I didn't ask for excuses." She hesitated, fingers trembling as she signed. "She's kind to me. She understands." "Enough!" He snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "I will not have my mother manipulated by staff seeking sympathy." Her breath caught. The humiliation was sharp, hot. Margaret entered just in time to hear the last sentence. Her eyes flared. "Elliot Vance!" He froze. She almost never used his full name. "How dare you speak that way to her?" she thundered. Her voice shook with fury, not weakness. "You think money gives you the right to crush gentleness, to twist kindness into lies?" Elliot stepped back, momentarily lost for words. Margaret turned to Amara, signing quickly. "Don't listen to him. You are not what he says." Amara tried to nod, but tears had already begun to spill. She dropped, ped the cloth, signed a single word, "Sorry," and fled from the room. Elliot's chest heaved. His mother stared at him in silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, weary. "You've built towers, Elliot, but you've turned your heart into stone." He looked away, jaw clenched, but the words sank deep. That night, Amara sat on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, signing to herself in the dim light. "You can't cry, not again. Be strong for Caleb." But she did cry, quietly, where no one could see. Down the hall, Margaret wrote in her journal, her hand shaking slightly. She'd seen the rage in her son's eyes, the same rage that had once destroyed their family. She whispered to herself, "I won't let it happen again." And somewhere deep in the mansion, Elliot stood alone in his office, staring out at the city lights, the reflection of his own fury staring back at him from the glass. Tomorrow, something would break. And it wouldn't just be Amara's silence. Rain lashed against the glass walls of Whitestone Manor like a warning. The morning began gray and restless, the kind of day when the house seemed to hold its breath. Amara stood in the east corridor, polishing the windowsills. Her eyes were heavy from lack of sleep, her mind echoing with fragments of yesterday's humiliation. Every gesture she made felt cautious now, fragile, as if she were moving through a house made of glass and secrets. She told herself to stay quiet, to keep her head down, to survive. But something inside her, something small and trembling, was beginning to ache for more than survival. Elliot's footsteps announced his presence before she saw him, sharp, purposeful, angry. He entered the hall with the same stormy energy that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Where is my mother?" he demanded from one of the butlers. "In the solarium, sir, with Miss Bell." Elliot's jaw tightened. Without a word, he turned on his heel and strode toward the sunroom. The solarium was bathed in the soft silver light of rain. Garrett sat on a cushioned chair, a blanket over her knees, her hands moving in graceful rhythm. Across from her, Amara mirrored each gesture, signing slowly, her face warm with concentration. Their conversation was quiet, but full, laughter in the hands, tenderness in the eyes. Elliot stood in the doorway for several seconds, unseen, something twisting in his chest. His mother looked happy, so happy it made him furious. "Enjoying yourself?" he said, his voice cutting through the calm like a blade. Both women froze. Amara immediately stood, flustered, nearly knocking over the teacup. "Elliot," Margaret said, her tone weary. "We were just chatting?" he interrupted. "Or is she filling your head with sob stories about her poor life? How she needs pity from rich people?" "Stop it," Margaret's eyes flashed. "She's not using anyone. She's your employee, and she's been nothing but kind." Elliot turned his gaze on Amara, icy and hard. "You've got everyone fooled, haven't you?" Amara shook her head quickly, hands rising to sign. "No, sir, I didn't." He stepped forward, voice rising. "Don't you dare wave your hands at me like I'm stupid." Her hands froze mid-air. The silence that followed was unbearable. Only the soft patter of rain and Margaret's horrified gasp filled it. Elliot's anger burned hotter. "You think you can come into my home, turn my mother against me, make her laugh like nothing happened?" Margaret stood suddenly, her blanket falling to the floor. "Elliot Vance, that's enough." But it was too late. The damage was done. Tears welled in Amara's eyes, and she signed with trembling fingers. "I never meant harm. I just listen." Elliot stared at her hands, hands so delicate, so desperate. And for a brief second, something cracked in his anger, but pride sealed it back over. "Go," he said coldly. "You're dismissed." Margaret gasped. "Elliot!" I said, "Did go!" Amara hesitated, then turned and fled the room, the echo of her footsteps vanishing down the marble hall. Margaret's fury came like fire after the storm. "How could you?" she hissed. "That girl has done nothing but serve you with grace. She reminds me of the boy you used to be, the one who listened, who felt, who cared." Elliot turned away. "I don't need lessons in compassion, Mother, not from someone who left when I was 20. Her face softened, but her voice stayed firm. "You pushed me away, Elliot. You wanted to stand alone on your mountain. And now you're so high up you can't hear anyone below you crying." The words cut deep. He tried to hold his anger, but the pain was too raw, too close. "You don't understand what it takes to stay on top." "No," she said quietly, "but I understand what it costs." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the hollow echo of his own pride. Down in the servants' quarters, Amara packed her few belongings. Her hands trembled as she folded her uniform. Every small sound, the rustle of fabric, the creak of the floorboards, carried the ache of ending. She hadn't meant to interfere, she had only tried to help, but somehow she had become the spark that lit old wounds. When Margaret appeared in her doorway, Amara looked up, startled. "Please don't," she signed softly. "He doesn't want me here." Margaret crossed the room and sat beside her, taking her hands gently. "Let me worry about my son." Tears burned in Amara's eyes. "He hates me." "No," Margaret signed firmly. "He hates what he sees in you. Everything he's lost." Amara shook her head, signing quickly. "He only sees my silence." Margaret smiled sadly. "Then maybe it's time you let him hear what silence can say." That evening, thunder rolled across the sky. Elliot sat in his study, the firelight flickering against the shelves. The world outside raged, but inside the room, his mind was louder. His mother's words, Amara's trembling hands, they wouldn't leave him. He poured himself a drink, staring at the amber liquid. He saw his reflection, sharp, tired, angry. The face of a man who'd built everything, and yet had nothing. Somewhere in the distance, faint and soft, he heard something, not a voice, but a rhythm. He rose, following it through the halls until he reached the kitchen. There, through the half-open door, he saw Amara standing alone, humming softly while drying the last of the dishes. The tune was gentle, fragile, and the sound of it broke him. He hadn't realized until that moment how long it had been since music lived in his house. Amara turned and saw him in the doorway. Her eyes widened, then she bowed her head quickly, wiping her hands. "I didn't mean to," She began to sign, but stopped halfway. Elliot didn't speak. He just watched her, expression unreadable. Then, in a voice almost too low to hear, he said, "I didn't know you could sing." Her lips curved faintly. "Only when I'm alone." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe I've made you too lonely." She blinked, uncertain if she had read his lips correctly. But before she could respond, he turned and left, leaving her with a strange, fragile warmth beneath the ache. Outside, rain softened to drizzle. Inside, the first crack had formed in Elliot's armor. And somewhere deep in Whitestone Manor, the storm that had begun with anger was beginning to turn, towards something neither of them yet understood. The next morning arrived with silence, the kind that feels almost sacred after a storm. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Whitestone Manor, glinting off crystal and marble, washing away the sharp edges of the night before. Amara woke before dawn, though she hadn't slept much. Her heart was restless, caught between fear and something softer she couldn't name. She had expected to be fired, yet her uniform still hung neatly by the door, her name still on the schedule. She was still here. For how long, she didn't know. In another part of the house, Elliot stood before his mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling fingers. The reflection staring back was composed, the billionaire everyone expected. But his mind wouldn't stop replaying what he had seen the night before. Amara humming alone in the kitchen, the warmth in her voice, the fragility of it. He had shouted at her, humiliated her, dismissed her like a broken thing, yet she had sung to herself as if the world were still worth forgiving. And that unsettled him more than anything. By late morning, Margaret had taken to the veranda, a thick wool shawl over her shoulders. Her breathing was shallow, her color pale. She was growing weaker each day, though she hid it well. When Amara brought her tea, she immediately noticed the older woman's trembling hands. "You're not well," Amara signed gently. Margaret smiled faintly, her voice little more than a whisper. "I'll be fine, dear. Just tired of fighting ghosts." Amara hesitated, then signed. "You don't have to fight them alone." Margaret reached for her hand, squeezing lightly. "You remind me of light in a closed room. Quiet, but it fills the space." Tears welled in Amara's eyes. "You taught me to believe my silence mattered," she mouthed softly. Margaret smiled. "It always did." They were still talking when Elliot appeared in the doorway. His mother's color drained as she saw him. He looked different, not angry, just unsure. "Mother," he said quietly, "I need to talk to you." She studied him for a long moment. "Then talk." He glanced at Amara. "In private." Margaret shook her head. "No, whatever you need to say, you can say in front of her." Elliot hesitated, then exhaled, defeated. "Fine." He turned his eyes toward Amara, eyes that were no longer cold, only searching. "I was wrong yesterday." Amara blinked, startled. I let my anger speak," he continued, the words dragging out as though heavy. "It wasn't fair. You didn't deserve it." He swallowed, then added, "I've spent years thinking silence meant weakness. I didn't understand that sometimes it means strength." Margaret's eyes softened, pride and relief mingling in her expression. Amara hesitated, then slowly lifted her hands. "I forgive you." Elliot watched, unsure how to respond, until Margaret whispered, "She forgives you, Elliot." Something inside him broke. His throat tightened, his jaw trembled. He nodded once, barely managing, "Thank you." It was the first honest thing he'd said in a very long time. But peace rarely lasts long in houses built on secrets. Later that evening, during dinner, Margaret suddenly went pale. Her spoon clattered against the porcelain. "Mother?" Elliot's voice wavered. She clutched her chest, gasping. It's fine. Just..." Before she could finish, she collapsed forward. The room erupted in chaos. The servants froze, unsure what to do. Elliot shouted for someone to call an ambulance, but panic clouded his voice. "Get help, now!" Amara was the first to move. She darted to Margaret's side, checking her pulse, her breathing. Calm, precise, focused. Then her hands began to move rapidly in sign language. commanding the other maids and butlers. Bring water. Loosen her shawl. Raise her legs slightly. Get a towel. Her movements were sharp and certain. Even those who didn't know sign could feel what she meant. The staff scrambled to obey, moving in unison to her silent orders. Elliot knelt beside his mother, panic in his eyes. What's happening? Is she… Amara looked at him, hands flying. She's fainted. Keep her still. Breathe with her. He stared, realizing for the first time how much power her silence carried. Not weakness, not hesitation, but clarity. When the paramedics arrived minutes later, Amara stayed close, signing directions to one of them who spoke little English, helping him understand Margaret's condition. By the time Margaret was placed on the stretcher, her breathing had steadied. She reached for Amara's hand weakly and signed, "You saved me." Amara shook her head, tears welling. "You saved me first." Elliot stood frozen, watching their exchange. The paramedics wheeled Margaret away, and he could only follow in silence, his throat tight with something like shame and awe. Hours later, after the doctor assured him that his mother would recover with rest, Elliot stepped into the quiet hospital waiting room. Amara sat by the window, her hands clasped in her lap, staring out at the rain-soaked city. He approached slowly. "She's going to be all right," he said softly. Amara nodded, relief flooding her features. He hesitated, then added, "You were incredible. You took control when everyone else froze. I don't know what would have happened without you." She looked up at him, eyes glistening. Her hands moved hesitantly. Anyone would have done the same. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No one else could have." He sat beside her, exhaling slowly. "I keep thinking about how she told me once that listening is more than hearing. I never understood that until today." Amara smiled faintly. "She's right." Elliot's gaze lingered on her hands. "Could you teach me?" She blinked. "Teach you?" He nodded. "Sign language. I don't want to be deaf anymore. Not like this." Her lips parted, surprise softening into something gentler. A quiet smile that carried warmth and disbelief. She nodded. "Yes," she signed. "I can teach you." He smiled back. A small, uncertain thing. "Then maybe we'll both finally learn how to listen." Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was still gray, but there was light breaking through, just enough to glint off the glass of Whitestone's distant towers. And for the first time, Elliot didn't look away from it. The days that followed were slow, fragile thing. Like the quiet recovery after a long illness. Whitestone Manor no longer felt like the echoing palace it had been. It felt inhabited. Human. Margaret was home from the hospital within a week, paler but smiling, her voice still trembling when she spoke. She spent most of her mornings in the sunroom, a blanket over her knees, a teacup balanced carefully in her thin hands. Amara stayed nearby, helping her with medication, reading aloud from Margaret's favorite poetry books, her voice soft but steady. Elliot, meanwhile, began showing up at odd hours. At first, it was small, a hesitant wave across the hallway, a mumbled good morning when he passed Amara in the kitchen. Then, gradually, it grew into something else. He began sitting beside her while she prepared breakfast for his mother, asking questions, watching her hands move when she signed to the staff. And then one evening, as dusk washed the sky in shades of violet and rose, he approached her with a notebook. "I've been practicing," he said, opening the small book. His handwriting was elegant but uncertain. Inside were shaky drawings of hand positions, letters, and arrows. Amara looked down at the page, then up at him, smiling, amused. He sighed. "You can laugh. I know it's terrible." She shook her head, lifting her hands. "Not terrible. Trying matters more." He smiled, almost boyish. "Then tell me if I get this right." He lifted his hands and carefully signed, "Good evening." Amara's brows lifted. Impressed. "Good," she replied, but slower. He tried again. The movements were clumsy but genuine. When he looked at her again, she was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that warmed the air around her. It was in that moment Elliot realized that the silence between them no longer frightened him, it soothed him. Days turned into weeks, their lessons became routine, mornings began with coffee and signing practice. Evenings often ended in the garden, where Margaret would watch from her chair, a quiet witness to something beautiful unfolding. Sometimes she would tease her son. "You finally found someone who can keep you quiet," she'd say with a faint laugh. Elliot would blush, murmuring, "Maybe that's what I needed." Amara would only lower her gaze, smiling softly, but her heart would race with every lesson, every shared look, every wordless moment charged with something unsaid. One evening, as autumn winds began to bite, Elliot found himself standing in the manor library. The fire was low, and the air smelled of dust, books, and faint lavender, Amara's scent from earlier that day. He stared at the portrait of his late father, a stern man with hard eyes and a jaw of stone. For years Elliot had tried to be that man, ruthless, silent in a different way, a silence of pride, of distance. Now, looking at the painting, he felt only tired. He turned when he heard soft footsteps behind him. Amara stood in the doorway, hesitant. He gestured for her to come closer. "I used to think this house needed to sound like power," he said quietly, "that silence meant fear or submission." He turned to her, voice breaking slightly. "But now I think, maybe silence is where the truth hides." Amara's eyes shimmered. She lifted her hands. "Silence is not empty. It's full of words you don't yet know how to say." Elliot's breath caught. "You always know how to say things I can't." She smiled gently, "Because I've spent my life listening to what others miss." There was a pause, one that hung between them, heavy and alive. Elliot stepped closer. "Amara," he hesitated, searching her eyes. "Would it frighten you if I said that I—" Before he could finish, a sharp sound shattered the air, the crash of breaking glass. They both turned. From the corridor came shouting. A servant's voice, panicked and urgent. "Sir, it's Mrs. Whitmore! She's fallen again!" Elliot's blood turned cold. He sprinted past Amara, down the hall toward his mother's room. Margaret lay on the floor beside her chair, her face ghostly pale, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. Amara dropped beside her without hesitation, checking her pulse, her breath. It was weak. Too weak. Elliot knelt beside them, helpless. "Mother, please." Amara's hands moved rapidly. "We need an ambulance, now." He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling so hard he could barely dial. As he called for help, Margaret's eyes fluttered open. She looked at both of them, her son, frantic and broken, and the young woman cradling her hand, and a faint smile touched her lips. "Don't be afraid," she whispered. "Some things must end, so others can begin." Her breathing hitched, once, twice, and then stopped. Elliot's voice broke. "No! No! No! No!" He pressed his forehead to her hand, sobbing. "Please, please, stay." Amara's hands trembled as she checked for a pulse again. Nothing. Her vision blurred with tears as she looked up at him. There were no signs left to give, no words left to find. Only silence. Heavy. Final. Absolute. The ambulance arrived too late. That night, Whitestone Manor was darker than it had ever been. The walls seemed to mourn. Even the clocks ticked slower. Elliot didn't speak to anyone. He locked himself in his study, refusing food, refusing comfort. Amara stood outside the door for hours, listening to the muffled sounds of grief within. When the house finally fell silent, she sank to the floor outside his door, tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling in her lap. She signed to the emptiness, "You're not alone." And though no one saw it, though no one answered, somewhere, behind that locked door, Elliot heard her anyway. The morning of the funeral arrived, shrouded in mist. Whitestone Manor stood cloaked in silence, its ivy-draped walls weeping with dew, its gates lined with sleek black car. As inside, servants moved like shadows, soft, reverent, broken by loss. Margaret Whitmore's coffin rested in the grand hall beneath the chandelier she had loved. White lilies surrounded it, filling the air with their sweet, mournful fragrance. A single beam of light cut through the tall windows, falling across her peaceful face. Amara stood near the back of the hall, her dark hands folded neatly before her, her black dress simple but immaculate. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, only quiet sorrow. Her eyes were rimmed red from sleepless nights, but her posture remained graceful, almost reverent. Elliot stood at the front, shoulders squared but trembling. His jaw was tight, his eyes hollow. He had not shaved in days. The people who gathered, billionaires, socialites, distant relatives, offered condolences in murmured voices. But none of them truly knew what Margaret had meant to him. And fewer still knew the young woman standing silently in the corner, the one who had been his mother's final comfort. When the service began, the priest spoke of peace, of forgiveness, of the grace found in silence. But Elliot barely heard. His mind was filled with Amara's last words to him, the way she had tried to hold him together as he fell apart. Silence is not empty. It's full of words you don't yet know how to say. Now, he realized, he had so much to say. After the guests left and the hall emptied, Elliot approached the coffin alone. His hand trembled as he laid a single rose upon it. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For all the years I thought strength meant shutting everyone out." Behind him, footsteps, soft, familiar. Amara had come to tidy the flowers, to help close the hall, but when she saw him there, so still, so lost, she froze. He turned. Their eyes met across the room. "Don't leave," he said quietly. She hesitated, then stepped forward, her hands moving gently. "You should rest." He shook his head. "I can't. Not yet." He gestured toward the chaise. "Eat beside him. Please." They sat together in the flickering half-light. For a long while, there was only silence, the kind that felt sacred. Then Elliot spoke, voice raw. "You know, I used to think people like you worked for people like me. That was the order of things. I thought kindness was weakness. But you proved me wrong, without ever saying a word." Her eyes shimmered with quiet sadness. "I didn't mean to prove anything." He smiled faintly. "You did more than that. You gave my mother peace." She signed, slowly. "She gave me something too. She made me believe I wasn't invisible anymore." That hit him like a blade. His throat tightened. "Amara, I made you feel invisible, didn't I?" She looked away. Her silence said enough. He rose to his feet suddenly, pacing. "I shouted at you. I humiliated you in front of others. God, He swallowed hard, voice cracking. "You didn't deserve any of it." Her eyes followed him, trembling. He turned back, emotions storming through him. "Do you have any idea how much that kills me now?" For the first time she reached out, her hand touching his arm lightly. Her fingers trembled, but her gaze was steady. "Then let the guilt make you gentle," she signed softly, "not broken." He froze. Then, slowly, he sank to his knees before her. The billionaire, once cold, commanding, and proud, knelt on the marble floor before the maid he had once despised. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "Amara, I don't know how to make it right. I just know I don't want this house, this life, to go back to what it was before you." Tears welled in her eyes, her hands lifted shakily. "You don't owe me anything." He shook his head fiercely. "I owe you everything. My mother's last smile, my first lesson in humility, every ounce of peace I feel when you're in the room. Everything." Amara's breath caught. She wanted to respond, but her hands froze mid-air. Emotion flooded her chest, so heavy it ached. Finally she signed, barely moving. "You're not the man you were. She'd be proud." His eyes closed. A single tear fell, landing on her hand. Then he said the words he had buried for too long. "I'm sorry." It wasn't grand, it wasn't rehearsed. It was raw and trembling and utterly human. Amara's lips parted slightly. Her eyes softened. She reached out again, this time taking his hand completely. In that simple gesture, something shifted. The mansion, once a monument of pride, became something warmer, something alive. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the coffin had been carried away, Elliot found himself standing at the window of his mother's room. The moonlight fell across the garden, illuminating the wind chimes Margaret had hung years ago. They swayed gently, whispering through the night. Behind him, Amara entered quietly. Elliot didn't turn. "I keep expecting to hear her voice," he said softly. "But maybe I still can, through you." Amara stepped closer, her hands moving gently. "She's still here. You feel her when you listen." He looked at her then. And for the first time in his life, Elliot Whitmore truly listened, not with his ears, but with his heart. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, alive with meaning, forgiveness, and something new, fragile, and unspoken. Love. That night, he didn't sleep in the master suite. He slept in the small guest room next to the servants' quarters, because that was where Amara had always been, where warmth still lived. He didn't ask for anything, he just wanted to be near her quiet presence, the soft rhythm of her breathing reminding him that not all good things need to be spoken aloud. Outside, the manor lights dimmed. The night held its breath. For the first time in years, Whitestone Manor slept in peace. Winter descended over Whitestone Manor, like a soft white veil. Snow blanketed the lawns and hedges, muffling the world into silence. A silence that no longer felt empty, but alive, sacred, and healing. It had been 3 months since Margaret's passing. The house had changed in quiet, invisible ways. The staff moved with new calm, their voices softer, their laughter genuine. Elliot had changed too. He still wore tailored suits, but the stiffness was gone. The sharp edge of command had softened into warmth. He no longer barked orders. He asked. And sometimes, though he was still learning, he listened more than he spoke. And Amara was no longer the invisible maid who kept her head down. She had become the house's pulse, the bridge between silence and speech. The staff adored her, the townspeople spoke of her with admiration, and every afternoon, Elliot found himself seeking her company as naturally as one seeks sunlight after a storm. That morning, the sun was pale, filtering through lace curtains as Amara set tea on the table near the window. She moved with the same quiet grace, the rhythm of someone who had learned to blend strength and gentleness into every step. Elliot entered, sleeves rolled, tie loose, holding a notebook. "I've been working on something," he said, his voice tinged with shy pride. He opened the notebook to reveal perfectly written lines, the alphabet in American Sign Language, every letter traced with care. Amara's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. "You learned all of it?" she signed. He grinned, almost boyish. "I had a good teacher." She laughed silently, shoulders shaking. "You're still slow with Q." He smirked. "Then you'll just have to keep teaching me." She tilted her head, teasing. "I thought you were too proud to take lessons from your maid." His gaze softened. "You're not my maid anymore, Amara." Her hands paused mid-air. He continued, voice low, honest. "You're the person who showed me how to speak without words, and how to feel without fear." For a moment, neither ved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock, counting heartbeats. Then he added, "I want to create something, a foundation, for those who can't speak or can't hear, to give them a place to learn, to belong. I'd like you to run it with me." Amara's eyes filled with tears. Her hands trembled as she signed. "Why me?" "Because you understand," he said simply. "You understand what it means to be unheard." She covered her mouth, emotion flooding her. Then, slowly, she signed, "Yes." He smiled, and in that moment, it was as if the whole house exhaled. Weeks passed. Together, they worked tirelessly, visiting clinics, schools, hiring teachers fluent in sign. Elliot handled the business side. Amara became the voice and soul of the project. Her quiet compassion drew people in. For the first time in her life, she was seen, truly seen, not as a servant, not as a curiosity, but as a leader. And through it all, the bond between them deepened. At first they were cautious, colleagues bound by grief and gratitude. But grief has a way of burning away pretense, leaving only truth, and the truth was simple. They had saved each other. On a late spring afternoon, they stood together in the garden Margaret had loved. The air smelled of lilacs and fresh rain. A new sign had been placed at the gate: the Margaret Foundation for Silent Voices. Amara traced the letters with her fingers, tears glimmering in her eyes. Elliot watched her quietly. "She would have been proud," he said. Amara looked up, smiling softly. "She is proud. She's still here." He nodded. Then, after a pause, he took a slow breath. "There's something I've wanted to say," he said, "but I've been afraid it would sound selfish." Amara tilted her head, waiting. He lifted his hands, awkward, trembling, but determined. His fingers moved through the signs carefully, each one slow and deliberate. "I love you." Amara froze, her breath caught. Elliot's eyes glistened. "I probably got it wrong," he whispered. But she was already smiling, radiant, tearful, trembling. Her hands lifted and answered in the same language, clear and sure. "I love you too." For a moment, time stood still. The wind moved through the trees, the chimes whispered softly, and two lives, once separated by silence, by class, by fear, found their harmony. He stepped closer. She didn't retreat. When his hand reached for hers, she let him hold it, not as an employer, not as a savior, but as an equal, as someone who finally understood what love meant beyond words. Later that evening, as twilight deepened, Elliot and Amara sat on the garden bench. Fireflies blinked lazily across the lawn. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand resting over his. He whispered almost to himself, "I used to think silence was a prison." She smiled softly. "Now?" He looked at her, eyes warm. "Now I think it's where love learns to speak." She closed her eyes, breathing in the quiet. And somewhere in the distance, the wind passed through the chimes again. A sound like a blessing, a lullaby, a farewell that wasn't really goodbye. Whitestone Manor no longer stood as a fortress of pride. It had become a home of forgiveness. And within its walls, the shy black maid, who had once been unseen, now held the heart of the man who had once been unfeeling. Their story didn't need grand declarations or witnesses. It lived in their hands, in the language they built together, a language born from silence, sorrow, and love.